My name is Dee Blackie, and my paper concerns research I did for my master's dissertation on the lived experience of child abandonment and adoption. The research was done in Johannesburg, South Africa from 2010 to 2014, but I continue to work in child protection and community empowerment through my NPO Courage. The illustration you can see was an artwork that I created of the over 600 newspaper articles I reviewed for a discourse analysis over the 4-year period into unplanned pregnancy, abortion, child abandonment, temporary care, and adoption. Then as now, the dominant discourse was the mass media, which shapes our understanding of child abandonment and adoption and the various role players in this child protection category. My work in this area started in 2010, our World Cup year. And of all the exciting newspaper covers that we saw in 2010, the only one that stopped me in my tracks was on the front page of the Times on Wednesday the 21st of July. And I want to give you a trigger warning, as the picture is quite distressing. It was a picture of a newborn baby girl who'd been abandoned on a rubbish heap on the outskirts of Soweto and who had died there. In terms of my personal subjectivity, I'd taken a year off from my business consulting career as I was recovering from postpartum depression following my 7th miscarriage, so my maternal instincts were on high alert. As with many South Africans, I was horrified at the thought of living in a country where children were being disposed of on rubbish heaps. Although I became aware of this issue in 2010, this practice is still taking place in South Africa, and with the impact of COVID and the concerning statistics on teenage pregnancy over the past year, most child protection officers believe that this challenge is on the increase again. However, government still refuses to release any statistics on child abandonment in South Africa. Just last month, a newborn baby was thrown from a moving vehicle in the middle of Cape Town, not far from where this conference is being held today. I decided to get involved in the child protection community, which led to a number of new adventures. In 2011, I helped to facilitate the formation of a national adoption coalition for South Africa. Why adoption, you may ask? Well, when you've been abandoned and there is no way to track down your biological family, the best long-term outcome for a child is to be adopted into a family where they can belong. We defined a vision which was about empowering the child protection community to create positive and permanent change in the lives of our children, and I developed a range of community engagement posters which we used to talk to people about crisis pregnancy, child abandonment, and adoption in the context of their communities. It was also at this point that I decided to return to university to complete my master's degree, exploring the lived experience of child abandonment in South Africa. And this was my problematique. It was estimated that over 3,500 babies were abandoned in 2010 by Child Welfare South Africa and the major metropoles. Research that I did in 2016 and 2017 for the National Adoption Coalition of South Africa indicates that this has remained constant. However, over the same period, adoptions have declined from 2,434 in 2010 to just 849 in 2021. At the time of my research, I reviewed the Registry of Adoptable Children and Parents. It indicated that of the 297 parents wanting to adopt, 14 were black parents, 190 were white parents, 43 were Indian parents, and the rest were unspecified. Most were seeking a child of their own race, and girls were preferred where gender was specified. Only 50 applicants would consider a child with special needs, which is a child who has HIV or AIDS, or physical or mental disability. Of the 410 children available for adoption, there were only 398 black children, 3 white children, 9 mixed-race children, and the rest were unspecified. There were an equal number of boys and girls. 38 were HIV positive, 22 were born premature, 53 with special need challenges, and ultimately only 29 possible parents for the registered children based on their specified criteria. Of most concern, however, was the fact that over 60% of the children were abandoned into care and less than 40% were formally consented for adoption. The management of abandoned children is governed by the Children's Act 38 of 2005, which was implemented in 2010. It's believed to be a progressive piece of legislation. However, its implementation is problematic, especially when it comes to adoption. Illegal immigrants are unable to legally place their child in the formal child protection system in South Africa and face deportation should they try. Relinquishing one's parental rights so that a child can be adopted can only be done without a legal guardian's consent from the age of 18 years, making this option inaccessible to teenage mothers. A child of any age can request an abortion in South Africa, sending mixed messages about the option of adoption. Anonymous child abandonment has been criminalized, with mothers facing a range of charges such as concealment of birth and attempted murder should they attempt this and get caught. Baby safes are considered illegal in terms of the Children's Act. However, more and more are being opened in response to the crisis that continues to unfold. Many child protection officers voice concern that the Act is being used as a tool to prevent adoption rather than to facilitate it by the Department of Social Development, the courts, and the Department of Home Affairs, in what I came to term the constructive prevention of adoption in South Africa. In terms of my methodology, I followed the people and conflicts I encountered around child abandonment to create a multi-sited mobile ethnography in the tradition of George Marcus. This was necessary as I found that a child could be abandoned in Alexandra, be attended to by police in Tembisa, the mother could be sought in Berea or Hillbrow, and the child could be placed in a temporary care home in Soweto. A flexible approach to my field site was critical. I focused on 4 levels of inquiry in my formal research. Firstly, the portrayal of teenage pregnancy, abortion, the abandoning mother, and the abandoned child by the media. The management of the abandoning mother and the abandoned child by the police, medical practitioners, and adoption social workers in the child protection community. The experience of child abandonment from the perspective of the abandoning mother and the child who has been abandoned. And finally, the understanding and treatment of the abandoning mother and the abandoned child by psychiatrists and psychologists versus traditional sangomas and inyangas. Cultural concerns were often cited as the reason for the low levels of adoption in South Africa, specifically the legal process of removing one family's rights to a child and placing these rights into that of another family. This legal act was believed to be in contravention of lay beliefs surrounding ancestral belonging and was viewed as foreign to African belief systems. Formally relinquishing one's rights to a child through the process of adoption was viewed with genuine concern by many of my respondents, as illustrated in this quote. Most of the young women I spoke to believed that this would be seen as a conscious act of rejecting a child that had been given to them by their ancestors, and who could then exact a similar punishment for that of abortion, specifically that they would not be given another child, which would have major consequences for future marriage prospects and their role in their family. Nurses in public hospitals openly told me that they believed abortion and adoption were morally wrong, and that the young girls would suffer in the long term for choosing either of these alternatives. There was also a belief that if they helped a woman to abort a child or were complicit in placing a child up for adoption through phoning an adoption social worker on behalf of the birth mother, they would be found guilty by association. As such, they too could suffer some form of punishment from their ancestors. Many of my participants noted how if a woman could not take care of her child, she would do better to abandon them into someone else's care, as she could always apologize to her ancestors at a later stage and claim that she was not herself at the time. Unlike adoption, abandonment was not necessarily seen as permanent. There was a dominant belief amongst the community members that I spoke to that if a child is born to an African family, it will always be part of that family, as they share a fundamental and sacred connection forged through their ancestors. Young men told me of their despair at discovering that they were adopted on the death of a parent, that they had been told by their extended family that they could not inherit their family home, as they did not truly belong to their adoptive family, despite this right being confirmed by our Constitutional Court as recently as 2020. They shared how their abandonment was a painful, embodied experience that they continued to struggle with. They believed that their lack of connection to their biological family and their ancestors impacted on their ability to define who they were and where they belonged in the world. They shared how their lives were troubled and expected only troubled futures, as their lack of connection to their father's ancestors prevented them from performing important family ceremonies, rituals, and traditions. What I observed throughout my research was the systematic medicalization of child abandonment in the tradition of Corrad, when everyday life occurrence, in this instance child abandonment, is transformed into a medical category, defined in medical terms, and described and understood using medical language and frameworks, and treated through medical intervention. It was why I decided to call my thesis Sad, Bad, and Mad, as I watched how young, pregnant Black women were individualized, demonized, and ultimately medicalized through the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and postpartum depression for falling pregnant and then making the desperate decision to abandon their child. This diagnosis of mental illness, whilst removing the moral judgment, allowed society to dismiss her behavior as a disease and medicate or remediate her accordingly in the tradition of Foucault's biopower. This also effectively removed their role in questioning how the young woman fell pregnant in the first place and was then forced into making such a life-threatening decision for both herself and her child. It was not unusual for different models of illness to coexist in the medicalization of child abandonment. The more Western social workers, psychologists, and psychiatrists would interpret the abandoning mother's suffering as depression and mental breakdown, and the abandoned child as a reactive attachment disorder. However, families and their traditional healers would interpret the same suffering as being caused by ancestors who create problems and bad luck for the mother and possibly even the child due to the disconnection of the child from their biological family. More than half of the sangomas I spoke to during my research were taking care of a child, either formally or informally, who'd been abandoned into their care. They believed this was probably due to their connection to the spiritual world and their ability to support the child and intercede on the child's behalf with their ancestors. The sangomas explained that ancestors have a particular view on how children should be produced in order for them to be recognized as part of a family. For a child to be accepted, it would need to be introduced to its father's ancestors. If a child is introduced to the ancestors of its mother's family, or that of a different and unrelated family, this would cause confusion and consternation amongst the ancestors. This is not to say that a child cannot be introduced to the ancestors, but that the ancestors must be consulted on the issue at hand, so that they can assist the child in finding his or her spiritual home. Without exception, the sangomas noted how consultation with one's ancestors at every stage of a child's life is critical. This included the decision to abandon a child or to adopt a child. They advised that a child would only cry for its parents if the abandoning mother had not consulted with the ancestors before making the decision to abandon her child in the first place. During my fieldwork, I was repeatedly told that children who did not know who their ancestors were could search for them all their lives with no success. Some may engage the help of a diviner who could tell them where to find their father's family, and they would then need to ask this family to intercede on their behalf with their ancestors. However, the sangomas revealed a different picture that seemed contradictory to this view. They told me that ancestors are in fact with you from the moment you are born, even if you do not know your father's name. The ancestors may not engage with you directly because you don't know how to address them, but they are always with you. If a child is adopted into a new family and announced to that family's ancestors, the child's and the family's ancestors can connect with each other, as the child's ancestors are already with them and the family's ancestors have been called appropriately using the family's rituals. A social worker in central Johannesburg advised me that traditional ancestral ceremonies did occur on occasion in their offices. The family would arrive with their sangoma and community elders. The adopted child would be introduced to the ancestors of the adopting family in a ritual or ceremony. If there was more than one wife, as in the case of a polygamist family, then it was also crucial that the other wives consented to the adoption of the child. She told me that these kinds of ceremonies assisted the child in being accepted into their new family at a spiritual level, which she believed was very important. However, there was definite conflict between the sangoma's spiritual beliefs and the legal practice of adoption, specifically the court's perceived authority over family creation. Without exception, the sangomas provided a different perspective on child abandonment to that of individualizing and medicalizing it. They recognized that much of the challenge lies with the breakdown in family systems and structures in South Africa, and with the individualization of the young pregnant woman. Rather than individualizing and medicalizing, they recommended a collective community approach to healing. The views of the sangomas indicate that legal adoption, rather than being rejected outright, should be expanded and enhanced with more spiritually relevant practices to ensure its support in the context of African ancestral beliefs. These are screenshots of a Facebook site we've been trying to close down since the beginning of this year. What was clear throughout my research is that there is a disconnect between people's day-to-day lived experience and their spiritual lives and personas, almost like parallel worlds. People behave in a particular way in their real lives and then attempt to correct these behaviors and representations in spiritual ceremonies. However, abandonment continues. Government and traditional leaders continue to vilify abandoning mothers, and children continue to be left in unsafe spaces or trafficked illegally. In my review of newspaper articles on abandonment from 2010 to 2013, I identified that 65% of abandoned children were newborns, 90% younger than a year, and 70% abandoned in unsafe sites which included toilets, drains, gutters, rubbish sites, dumps, parks, and the open veldt. Statistics from the Johannesburg morgues in 2016 indicate that of every 3 children abandoned, only 1 survives, and a Medical Research Council report from that same year revealed a significant link between abandonment and homicide of children under the age of 5, stating that a child born in South Africa is at its highest risk of being killed during its first 6 days of life. These are some pictures of the nearly 40 baby savers in operation in South Africa today. Baby Savers South Africa, in partnership with several child protection organizations, have proposed an amendment to the Children's Act to legalize the safe relinquishment of babies through baby savers as a safe alternative to unsafe abandonment. It is believed that the current legislation is extremely reactive and restrictive, and as such may be causing the high levels of unsafe baby abandonment. This new law would ensure Section 11 of our Bill of Rights, where everyone, including children, has the right to a life, and Section 28(2) of the Children's Act, calling for the best interests of the child to be met. This act of safe relinquishment would no longer be deemed illegal. However, this would not remove the illegality of unsafe baby or child abandonment. One of the primary benefits of this amendment is that it would provide a legal way for women to relinquish their baby anonymously without risk of prosecution. However, due to the anonymity of the relinquishment, it is being fiercely contested by the Department of Social Development. Thank you for your time and attention.